Good morning. Our Sunday school lesson today here at Weavertown Church is in Acts 12, 13 through 25. One of the men that is featured here is Herod. Herod, that is in our lesson, was the grandson of Herod the Great. Herod the Great had reigned when Jesus was born, and he had killed the baby boys, you remember, in an attempt to kill this king of the Jews. Herod was that Herod. The Herod that we have in our lesson is the one that killed John the Baptist. The historian Josephus quotes from the Jewish Mishnah saying that when someone is killed with a sword, it is actually having beheaded the person. He had also killed, we had said about he had killed James in chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. James was a brother of John, and that was with the sword, which was undoubtedly by beheading. Herod was king. He was known to be ruthless. He would kill without court and trial, but he wanted to wait here with Peter until the Passover was finished. So our lesson begins in verse 13, chapter 12, verse 13, and as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a damsel came to hearken, named Rhoda. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. Peter had been sleeping bound with two chains between two soldiers. There was a light that filled the prison. There was chains that fell off of Peter. And he was told to get up quickly, to get dressed, put on his sandals, and the two soldiers that were laying, probably one on each side, were not awakened. We had about 7 different miracles in chapter 11, and now in chapter 12, we have a number of miracles again taking place. The soldiers slept on. When they went out through the prison, they went through the first ward, second ward, and the guards there were sleeping, and they just simply walked out through. The gate opened of themselves, and they were outside. Peter was outside and was free. Meanwhile, the church was gathered for a prayer meeting, and they were gathered there on their knees, imploring God that he would hear them and possibly release Peter, or at least keep him safe, that he can be faithful unto the end. And then there's a knock at the door. And so Rhoda gets up, and she opens the door just for a little peep to see what might be there, and she is so surprised she can't hardly handle that. And then there's some more knocking at the door, and then she'll go and open the door again, and they said, oh, they were all surprised. He is surprised, and the people stand up and are amazed that he should be out of prison. And he leaves, and they don't hear from him again, at least as far as our record is concerned. Herod was an impetuous fellow. The Bible says in our lesson here today that there was no small stir for this part of him having escaped, and they hardly knew what to do with that this was not something that typically would happen in a prison, and certainly not when they had this number of soldiers guarding a noted prisoner as was Peter. Herod had wanted to kill Peter, but he wanted to maximize on his own kingly exposure, and so he wanted to wait until the Jewish Passover was finished so he could have the full attention of the Jews for this bad deed that he was going to do. So he had beheaded James, and Peter is next, but has escaped under the guard of the Roman soldiers. These 4 big burly soldiers against one armed man is really no match for God. They were against God, not man. And so this victory that Peter experienced in being outside the prison came to him as a reality after he was outside and had realized it was not a dream. Herod, we can suppose, was furious. It says that they examined the soldiers. Examination usually was by beating, and that beating was merciless. It was a kind of thing that they did to the apostles later in the book of Acts. The examining was done against those who were not Romans. A Roman could escape that kind of beating, which Paul had pleaded for one time, claiming his Roman citizenship, and that thereby this was spared of that bad kind of beating. I want to be reading now in verse 18. Now, as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among soldiers what was become of Peter. And when Herod had sought for him and found him not, he examined the keepers and commanded that they should be put to death. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and there abode. Maybe one of the interesting questions to think about, could it be that some of these soldiers that were guarding Peter might have been the very ones that were killing the little boys back in Bethlehem that time, when Herod had given the command to kill the little babies? We have here the particular scene acted out of sowing and reaping. We know about that application, that what a person sows, that he also reaps. Herod went from Jerusalem to Caesarea. So why did he do that? Well, he had suffered another defeat. And one of the ways to make up for that was to go to a party place. And he had a place up in Caesarea that was specially built, where they had things, sports to do. They had places there probably for feasting and drinking and having parties. He had 4 places for getaways, we were told when we were in Israel. It was Masada. We remember that as a stronghold up on top of a high, well, not mountain, but a high place up above the valley floor. There was Masada, and then there was a mountain where he had built a huge castle of some kind, many rooms. And in that place, he had built the building, and then he took the ground off of the mountain right beside it and carried it over on his castle, so that his castle was underground. He wanted it to be underground, and that was, they used slave labor, so that was not really a problem to get that kind of work done. And then he had Caesarea. There would be a 4th one, I can't remember just right now what our guide had said the 4th one was, but Caesarea was a place where they could go to for just a getaway for important people, especially for kings and nobles and those that they would entertain. So I think about Herod slinking away like a dog that has been beaten, kind of just goes away to try to enjoy life in a different way. This book, a commentary of Acts, has a picture of the racetrack at Caesarea. They had built stones as a big arena, and those seats were facing the Mediterranean Sea. And there was a large place where an oval area where they would have had horse races, foot races, different kind of games and sports. And there they also had then the castle for Herod and for his family. The centurion was there, so probably the soldiers had to be accommodated somewhere, either there at the Caesarea. We had been in there and saw many ruins. What they basically had there anymore to show us was just stub walls, maybe, I don't know, 3-4 feet high. And that would have shown a lot of different houses, small rooms, places where people could be entertained and accommodated until they were needed as bodyguards, possibly for Herod. There at Caesarea, they also had a harbor. Caesarea was along the Mediterranean Sea. At that place there, down here is Jerusalem. It's about 55, 60 miles from Jerusalem to Caesarea. Probably went down through the valleys here and went up then along a road between various towns till you get up to Caesarea by the sea. One of the features that was interesting, besides the other things that we saw there, was the entrance into this old city. Herod had devised a plan where they would come in through the gate, because there was a wall around the city. So they come in through the gate here, and this was high walls on both sides. They'd have to make a turn and go out this way, make a turn again to go into the city. That way you couldn't open the gates, and horsemen, soldiers and the infantry on the horses couldn't just go straight on in there in a high speed gallop, but had to make a turn when they were inside, go over there, make another turn, and in the meanwhile they could have people on the wall that could throw stones down on them, or maybe hot tar or stuff like that, to keep out unwanted people. His anger knew no limits. It says here that we are at verse 20. And Herod was highly displeased with them of Tyre and Sidon, but they came with one accord to him, and having made Blastus, the king's chamberlain, their friend, desired peace, because their country was nourished by the king's country. His anger knew no limits, and now it seems like the crosshairs were on Tyre and Sidon. Tyre was a very worldly city. It was originally it was an island off of the coast of Palestine. I think historians were saying it was about a half mile from the mainland to the island, and in later years they made a causeway to go across there. Tyre was a place that was very well situated for shipping, and then ships would come in from many different localities and bringing expensive kind of imports. And so the Romans would be trading with the Phoenicians, that's the kind of people that were there, and something happened in their communications, in their whatever was taking place, that Herod was highly displeased with them. And that always put society on high alert, because when he was displeased, when he was troubled, then all the city and all the country would be troubled with him. We don't know just how this Blastus was a man of goodwill between them, but it says that there was that they were nourished by the king's country. Verse 20. Over in 1128, it said there that there was a prophecy by Agabus, who signified that there should be a great dearth throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. While he was in power, there was this dearth throughout all the land, which means that they were short on food, and Tyre was dependent on the mainland for food, and so there was that incentive to have peace with Herod and with his people. Herod was a very vain fellow. He loved praise. Praise was more than money to Herod. He had plenty of money. The Jews were taxed by the Romans, you remember. And so the money that they needed for all these projects was ample. But one thing that he needed more of continually was to be praised. The Jews were a very weak people after 70 years of captivity in Babylon. So they were under tribute to Rome and were taxed, as we know. So that money flowed into their coffers and provided for all these extras that the Roman rulers enjoyed. Verse 21, and upon a set day would mean that they were probably there for a number of days, so that they had some time to make plans, to get an agenda together. On a set day, it was prepared for Herod to be arrayed in royal apparel, to be on his throne, and I assume it was on this arena that I had just showed you, so people could fill in with those in the seats and the standing room and be all around. And he would make an oration to the people. And upon his giving his speech, they cried out, probably very loudly, saying that this is a voice of a God, not of a man. Let me pick up that verse there, verse 22. And the people gave a shout, saying, it is the voice of a God, and not of a man. And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory, and he was eaten of worms, and gave up the ghost. That being smitten of worms was contrary to what is natural, because usually butterflies would lay eggs, worms would hatch on the outside and work their way in. Here, these worms were inside, and in a few weeks he had died and was removed from the scenes of life because he gave not God the glory. Interesting that he sought Peter's life. He was killing other people, and eventually he himself was smitten by God with this horrendous death by worms. I have also a harbor. This is a picture of what they had there in this place where we had been as tourists, of course. This building would be giving kind of like a museum and discussing how the Caesarea was set up. This was a picture that they think was probably the harbor, so that the harbor was man-made to protect from the waves of the sea, and the ships could go in there and be at dock and could be loading and unloading their wares and doing their business. There are other little places here that shows little enclaves where ships could go in and dock, and with that could do a lot of business. Historians say that there was room at this Caesarea for 300 ships to dock and to be doing their business. So some of these things that we have from the Bible doesn't seem like maybe it would be very large, but in fact it is very large. Some of their things were by more people than we could imagine, and their commerce was probably quite extensive. Because it was difficult to carry much over land, going by sea was the best way to move products. Herod's speech was flawless. I want to read from my commentary. I can make better use of my words, so that would say a little bit what they had that day, possibly. The speech was flawless. The eccentric dignitary is at his manicured best to offset the recent embarrassment in Jerusalem. His silver-clad robe shimmers in the midday sun. The breezes off the sea contribute to making this a perfect day, a moment to remember. Herod strikes his closing statements with great confidence and emphatic cleverness as he raises both arms to a full stretch. The crowds are pumped and ready with the choreographed ending. In unison they shout in the highest decibels, "It is the voice of a God and not of a man," shouting in countless repeats. Herod had sought self-glory, which our text says was the cause for his agonizing death. We cannot imagine the unreachable horror of such a terrible way of dying. Herod had beheaded John the Baptist, sat in judgment against Jesus, killed James, and was not deterred from pursuing Peter. The successes of his reign were experiencing various setbacks. There is no substitute for repentance. I want to close this lesson with just this timeline of God. With the end of this chapter, we're going to go into chapter 12 and chapter 13, right? Chapter 13, and there it begins with Paul and Barnabas, and that will be then the missionary time from there on through the book of Acts. The timeline of God begins with creation, and the timeline of God expands to include the law, and then it expands some more to include the prophets, and expands more yet to include the cross of Christ, and the promised Messiah has come, gives his life for the world, is resurrected, and following that is Pentecost, which broadens the way of God yet further in preparation for the gospel going to the whole world. There is then the missionary era, which begins with Acts chapter 13, and goes on through then to where it expands further into the world, especially notably Europe, and especially then to America and to us. The other era that I noted here is the Bible printing era, when the Bible becomes available for the common man, which was a great breakthrough, whereby the harvest of God was increased very greatly.